Welcome to another edition of Inquiring Mind. I am your host, Don't Inquire. Today, I will be talking about Diablo III and how its in-game content spectacularly falls short of being awesome. And it could be so much better. Here's why. So, the Diablo III experience from start to finish is that you level up, you get items, you get some Paragon levels, you go through the rifts, you go through the greater rifts, you level up your gems, and then you just kind of keep doing more and more of that over and over and over again until I guess you get bored. And how quickly you get bored is very much a factor of how the randomness in the game contributes to your play experience. So, what in the game is random? Well, the loot is random, okay. The tile sets in the rifts are random. The bosses that you fight in the rifts are random. And the enemies that you fight in the rifts are also random. Okay, so you got all of these random elements. That should make for a lot of replayability in the game. Well, typically, unconstrained randomness, where you just take everything you have and you throw it into a dice roll, that's usually boring. It always ends up being boring. Because there's nothing new or exciting the more and more and more you play the game. So, if you're leveling a character in Diablo 3 and you go into a Nephilim Rift at level 1, it is possible, being the very lowest level in the game with no gear on, that you fight a boss. And that boss is the exact same boss that you would fight in a Greater Rift 150, the hardest content in the entire game by a wide margin. Now, why is that even possible? There are only two ways that could be good. Either way one, that when you see the boss at the lowest level, they have none of their abilities, and they're slow, and they're unresponsive. And that when you see them at Greater Rift 150, they are super fast, they have all of their abilities unlocked, they're extremely powerful, and they rotate through their moves randomly. You know, if you did that, maybe I could understand it. But as it stands, going through the game from the lowest level, level 1, up to Greater Rift 150, the content of the game is identical across the board. And that is just so incredibly boring, because you don't give the player any incentive to achieve anything. There's no reason. It's literally just, well, compete with the other players who are all doing the same stuff over and over and over again. And then if you talk about the item system and its randomness, well, any enemy could drop any item in the game. It's totally random. Well, not really. Because if you throw enough time at the game, and not a lot of time, really, somewhere to the tune of like 50 or 100 hours if you're playing relatively efficient, you can find every single item in the game pretty much, period. You've got the crafting system, which involves the cube, and then you've got the gambling system, which involves blood shards. Between those two and monster drops, any player within, 100 hours in a season can have every single item in the game. And then it just becomes a question of, well, can I find a 10% better version of this item? I think that penultimately illustrates how the randomness in Diablo 3 is really bad. Because you want to constrain some of that stuff. You don't want the player to get every single item in the game. You don't want the player to fight every single boss in the game at every single power level. It's just so incredibly boring. That's basically you, the developers, saying, we want every player who interacts with our game to see every bit of content we create. And I mean, you can make games like that, but they're gonna get boring a lot faster. How could this be addressed? How is it that in 4 years since Reaper of Souls has been announced and launched, that this is still the case for the Diablo 3 endgame? Well, there's some very simple solutions to this that take little to no rearrangement. The number one thing that you could do is take some of these really powerful items and just remove them from the drop pool. Just take them out so that players can no longer acquire them. You will put them back into the drop pool at the higher tiers of Greater Rift, say Greater Rift 50, Greater Rift 75, Greater Rift 100. But they're not arbitrarily tied to that level of Greater Rift. You tie them to the boss encounter. A level 1 character should only be able to encounter a handful of Greater Rift bosses, or Nephilim Rift bosses, whichever one you want to call it. So, as the player levels up, they gain access to the more difficult encounters in the game. This is exactly how it worked at launch with the original Diablo 3 game. Because In the normal mode, you would have enemies that just had one affix, mortar, frozen, desecrator. That was it. And then as you advance now in the second difficulty, they can have 2. And in the third difficulty, they can have 3. And in the fourth difficulty, they can have 4. So you are basically ramping the difficulty up for the player in terms of, not only the numbers, but also what the monsters are capable of. Well, you can't do that if you throw, the rhyme at a level 1 character or a max level Paragon 1000 character. It's exactly the same fight for both of them. So pull a difficult boss out that's like that. Pull out a bunch of the Greater Rift bosses so that players don't see them on the way up. Put them into breakpoints in the Greater Rift system. So as you hit Greater Rift 50, now you've unlocked, 5 additional bosses. And as you go up to Greater Rift 60 and 70, the likelihood that you'll see one of those 5 bosses increases dramatically. And those bosses drop loot specific to the difficulty of their rift, right? So you now all of a sudden you create a system like Diablo 2 where only specific bosses drop specific items. And this will bypass this problem of players hitting the season, getting a set, immediately getting all of the ancillary items within, 50 hours. And now the players will have a real sense of progression, because completing a Greater Rift 50 will be a lot more difficult because you can't get some of the best items for every build, and you have to advance along the way. And you could make it so that, okay, Greater Rift 100, you unlock the final Rift bosses, and these would be the cream of the crop, the hardest Rift bosses. Their mechanics could also be much stronger and much more punishing than they currently are as you scale them all the way down or all the way up. And I think, this is something relatively simple from an implementation perspective, that it kind of baffles me when you see how bad the randomness has been implemented in Diablo 3, why they don't just make very simple changes like this. Just let me know what you think in the comments. If you'd like to see more of my rants about randomness, I plan on making another video about how randomness is good in video games. As always, thanks for watching.